Next in our series of video lectures. This one, what I'm going to talk about is budget constraints, indifference curves, utility maximization, and then hopefully build to illustrating to you income and substitution effect. So let me just review some of the things that I spoke about in class. Here we have a budget constraint, and in order to construct a budget constraint you have to have multiple pieces of information. First you have to know, number one, how much income you have to spend. You also need to know the prices of the two products that you're going to be purchasing. In our purposes, I selected beer and pizza as two commodities that we are purchasing. So if beer is $2.50 and pizza is $1 and I have $5 to spend, if I buy beer I can only buy 2 beers. If I take 5 and divide it by 2.5, that gives us 2. So here, if I spend all my money on beer, I will get 2 beers, $5 in total being spent. If I decide on the opposite end that I want to spend all my money on pizza, if I have $5 to spend and pizzas cost me $1 a piece, I can buy 5 pizzas. So those are the two extreme ends of the budget constraint, and if you connect them with a straight line, that will give you your budget constraint. What's important to know is what happens when things change. If income changes or price changes, how does that impact the budget constraint? So let's take a look at that. And the example here is income has gone up to $10. So people's incomes have doubled. When your income doubles, that means you can buy more of both commodities. In our case, is pizza and beer. So what's going to happen is the budget constraint is going to shift outward. It's going to be a parallel shift from the original budget constraint. So remember that when income changes, the entire budget constraint shifts. It can shift to the right, as in the case of an increase in income, and also can shift to the left because of a decrease in income. So let me pull up the new budget constraint here. That's budget constraint 2, and let me shift that outward to reflect that. So there's the new budget constraint. It shows that I can buy 10 pizzas if I spend all my money on pizza, whereas before I could only buy 5. And it also shows that if I decide to spend all my money on beer, I can buy 4 beers, where previously I could only buy 2 beers. Well, let's take a look at what happens if we have a decrease in income. If we go from $10 to $5 in income, that means I can consume less of both products. So again, the budget constraint is going to shift inward. It's going to be a parallel shift to the left from the original budget constraint. So let me pull up the new budget constraint and let me shift that to the left. So because of a decrease in income, we've gone from budget constraint 1 to budget constraint 2. You can see the opportunity set is smaller with budget constraint 2 versus budget constraint 1. So when income decreases, the budget constraint shifts to the left. Let's see if we change prices. So for example, here's our original price of beer at $2.50. We're going to raise the price to $5, and we have an income of 10. What's going to occur? Well, realize that when you change the price of a particular product, the budget constraint does not do a parallel shift. It sort of rotates. All right, it pivots on the axis where the price doesn't change. So in our example here, if I change the price of beer, the amount of pizza that can be consumed is not going to change. So we're going to stay at being able to purchase 10 pizzas and 0 beers, but the budget constraint will rotate inward. So let me bring up that budget constraint and let me see if I can show that for you. And here you are. Here is an example of the budget constraint. The phrase I use is rotate inward. It doesn't change when it comes to pizza because I did not change the price of pizza. So the budget constraint rotates inward, and it's illustrating the fact that previously, when the price of beer was equal to $2.50, I could afford to buy 4, but now that the price of it's gone up to 5, I can only purchase 2. And let me bring this up. That looks pretty much the same, doesn't it? What did I mess up here? That's 25 and 20. Alright, so I'm sorry I had a little bit of a brain cramp there. We are going to show the price of beer, instead of increasing, decreasing. So the price of beer is going to go from $5, and at that we can only purchase 2. We are going to lower the price to $2.50. So let me bring that information in, and let me rotate that budget constraint outward. So because of the price of beer has fallen, we can consume more beer. Now if we spend all our money on beer, we can get 4 beers, where previously we could only get 2. Note again that the total amount of pizza that can be consumed remains the same, because the price of pizza has remained unchanged. So let's just review that. Here's our original opportunity set. So remember that the opportunity set is the area to the left, the triangle that's created by the budget constraint. That is your opportunity set. Here's our opportunity set. So if I lower the price of beer, let's say I lower it by half so I can purchase 8, we could see that the opportunity set increases. Here's our original opportunity set. And when the price of beer falls by 1/2, the opportunity set increases. Same thing for pizza. If the price of pizza declines by 1/2, now I can consume 10. You could see that the budget constraint has shifted, but also that the opportunity set has increased in size. If we do income, we're going to be shifting outward on both of these axes. So we're going to be able to buy more pizza, but we are also going to be able to buy more beer because our income can be spent on both of those products. So realize that when there's an increase in income, what occurs is the budget constraint parallel shifts outward from the original budget constraint and shows that you can produce more pizza and more beer, and the opportunity set increases because of that. Couple of things to remember about the budget constraint. I want you to make sure you remember what the slope of the budget constraint is. The slope of the budget constraint is the ratio of the prices, and because it's downward sloping, it is negative. So make sure that you remember that the slope of the budget constraint is equal to negative the price of beer, or the price of X, divided by the price of Y. Also, the two extreme endpoints here. If I decide I'm going to spend all my money on beer, this point on the budget constraint is just your income level divided by the price of beer or by the price of X. The same thing for here. If I were to spend all my money on pizza, I would just take my income level, divide by the price of pizza, and that would tell me if I were to spend all my money on pizza, how much pizza I could purchase. So realize that. And if you think about it, if you know that that's what that point is, and that's what this point is, the slope of this line is the rise over the run. And if I do that, I end up getting this, rewriting it in this form, and then by simplification I get that the slope of this line is negative the price of X, price of beer in our case, divided by the price of Y. Now we shift over to indifference curves. Make sure you remember the number one thing to remember about an indifference curve is that any point on the same indifference curve yields the same level of utility. So for example, point A, that represents 4 pizzas and a beer. Eating 4 pizzas and drinking a beer will give the same level of utility as if the person gets 1 pizza and 4 beers. So make sure that you remember that any points on the same indifference curve yield the same utility. In this example, points A and Z both give identical levels of utility. Make sure you also remember that they are negatively sloped and convex to the origin. They look like something like this. You can get into some different shapes, but if you take some upper level courses, you can get an idea of how the shapes of this vary depending on certain situations. Make sure you remember this also, that the slope of the indifference curve is the negative of the marginal utility of pizza divided by the marginal utility of beer. All right. And I think that is incorrect. It is the marginal utility of beer over the marginal utility of pizza. So make sure you get that correct. And this is known as the marginal rate of substitution. So make sure you remember what the slopes of the budget constraint and the slopes of the indifference curves are. Make sure you also realize that the further the indifference curve is from the origin, the further it moves away, the higher the level of utility. For example, indifference curve A might represent 10 units of utility. Indifference curve 2 might represent 20, and indifference curve 3 might represent 30. So points A and B both generate 10 units of utility. But also remember that the further the indifference curves move away from the origin, the higher the level of utility. So that's what economists mean by an indifference map. That there are infinite number of indifference curves that appear on this indifference map. So make sure you remember that the further away the indifference curves are from the origin, the higher the level of utility. Also remember that indifference curves can never intersect one another. Let's follow this through logically. Why is it that it's impossible for this to occur? Well, one of the things that I told you is that if you're on the same indifference curve, you get the same level of utility. So for example, A and B are both on indifference curve 1. So the combination that's A and the combination that's B and the combination that's A, the utility from them should be equal to one another. The same thing holds for indifference curve 2. Indifference curve 2 contains point A and point C. So therefore A and C, since they are on the same indifference curve, should give you the same level of utility. Well, if the utility of A is equal to the utility of B and the utility of A is equal to the utility of C, that tells me that the utility of B is equal to the utility of C. Well, however, there's a problem with this. Bundle B contains 5 pizzas and 1 beer, while Bundle C contains 8 pizzas and 1 beer. Bundle C has 3 more pizzas with the same amount of beer when compared to point B. And since we know that more consumption leads to higher levels of utility, the utility at B has to be less than the utility of C. So since that's the case, we've logically disproven that the utilities of these are equal to one another, And the only way this situation can occur is if they intersect one another. So just make sure you remember that indifference curves should not intersect one another. So here is the utility maximizing position. If we are on the indifference curve, that's the furthest away from the origin, and still touches the budget constraint, that combination of the two commodities, in our case here, beer and pizza, that is what will maximize utility. So this person, given this budget constraint, given the income and prices, and given their preferences between the two commodities, would consume 4 pizzas and 2 beers, and they would maximize their utility. Well, let's compare this to a couple other scenarios. I just told you that the point A is the one that maximizes utility. Well, point C and point B are on the budget constraint. So that tells us that points B and C are affordable. I can afford to buy the combination that's B and the combination that's C. Why is point A preferable? Well, point A is preferable because it yields higher utility. How do I know it yields higher utility? Because it is tangent to a higher indifference curve. Here we have a lower indifference curve. The utility that's associated with B and C is less than the utility that's associated with A, because A is on an indifference curve that's further away from the origin. Therefore, this person is maximizing utility relative to B and C because they are spending the same amount of money, but they are generating higher utility because of that spending. Now let's take a look at point D. Point D is unaffordable. That's the thing you need to know about it. Point D is to the right of the budget constraint. Anything that is to the right of the budget constraint is unaffordable. All right, so here we are. We're at that initial equilibrium. Let's take a look at what happens to that equilibrium if there's an increase in income. All right, so what happens is, and let me bring that up, if there's an increase in income, the entire budget constraint shifts to the right. And let me draw this in a little bit better. So our budget constraint shifts to the right. What do we need to do? We need to be just tangent to the indifference curve that's just touching the budget constraint. So because of the increase in income, our budget constraint has shifted outward. That's our new budget constraint. Now we have to become just tangent with the indifference curve that's the furthest from the origin. So the point B is our new equilibrium. And at that new equilibrium, sorry I didn't really put that, the graph, the adjustment I made to the graph just right. So with this increase in the income, our new utility maximizing consumption for this individual is 5 pizzas and 3 beers. If we lower the price of beer, the budget constraint will rotate out and will move out. Oop, let me get that right. We'll move out and rotate outward in this fashion. So here's our new budget constraint, and now we have to get to the indifference curve that's just tangent to that budget constraint. So here we have a scenario again. We have an increase, a decrease in the price of beer, which shifts out the budget constraint. So the decrease in the price of beer causes our budget constraint to shift outward. And now we are just tangent to an indifference curve that's the furthest out. So that is maximizing utility based upon the new budget constraint. Given this, we see that we have pizza production of 5, I'm sorry, pizza consumption of 5 and beer consumption of 3. Let me bring that up. So we are at that new equilibrium point. Well, for the income and substitution effects, remember what I told you in class is that if I lower the price of a particular product, there are two effects that are going to go on that impact consumption. There's a substitution effect. The substitution effect that happens is the fact that, for example, in this scenario, I've lowered the price of pizza. It's possible that I could consume more beer because it is cheaper relative to pizza. All right? So as I lower the price of beer, I might consume less pizza and more beer because of the change in the relative price. But also make sure you realize that there is also an income effect. If you think about it, if I lower prices, a portion of what's going on is an income effect. Because of the fact that these are lower prices, I still have income that's available to me. I could stay at a consumption level, for example, of 4 and 2, where I was originally, but if I consume at that level, I have income left over. So the fact that the price of pizza fell, if I keep my consumption the same, I have additional income that I can spend. The lowering of the price actually generates income for the individual. So the question is, how are we going to disentangle this? How can we figure out what is the income effect and what is the substitution effect? The way that we can do this, all right, is to take the original, our new budget constraint and parallel shifting it inward until it's just barely tangent to the original budget constraint. In essence, causing the budget constraint to shift inward like this. Because remember what I told you, if there's an income change, you have a parallel shift of the budget constraint outward from the original budget constraint. To take that income effect out, if I want to take out the impact of income, if I shift back inward in a parallel fashion to the original indifference curve, that will take out the impact of income. So here is where we are right now. We are going to have to shift that budget constraint inward. And I did that. I shifted the budget constraint inward. So here's our original budget constraint. Budget constraint 3 is the budget constraint after the price change, and then budget constraint 2 is the budget constraint after I did a parallel shift that I took out the income effect. All right? So if we take a look at this, here's our original level of consumption. After the change in the price, so I went from consuming 4 pizzas and 2 beers to consuming 5 pizzas and 3 beers because of the change in the price of beer. When I shift this budget constraint inward parallel until it's just tangent to the original indifference curve, that gives me a consumption level of 2.2 pizzas and 3.3 beers. So what I've been able to do here is I can split out the impact of income and the impact of the substitution effect. So make sure you realize that the change in consumption that we go from this point to this point is manifested in two situations, the income and the substitution effect. The change from point A to point Z can be broken down into two separate components. It can be broken down into the income effect, and it can be broken down into the substitution effect. Another way of thinking of this is, here's our original budget constraint. All right, there's a change in the price of pizza. In the price of beer. Here is the budget constraint that would have existed in our original scenario if I use that price ratio. So taking out the impact of income And the fact that when I lowered the price of beer, it freed up income that I could spend on on it and on pizza. Um, in doing that, all I'm doing is maximizing utility on the previously existing indifference curve, but using the new price ratio. Well, that gives us the equilibrium of W. So that gives me solely the impact of substitution. Because of the fact that I'm keeping the indifference curve the same, but I'm using the new price ratio, I'm measuring the change in consumption that is due solely to the change in the price. So I move from point A to point W. That level of consumption is solely caused by the change in the relative prices of beer and pizza. Then when we go from W to Z, that tells me the impact of income. Because now, what have I gone to? I've gone to another budget constraint that was a parallel shift of the original budget constraint. So maybe that's a better way of taking a look at it, is here's our original budget constraint, here's my original indifference curve. The relative prices of beer and pizza change, therefore I have a different budget constraint based upon the difference in those relative prices. Given the difference in those relative prices, I would move from point A to point W. And that is solely the substitution effect. The only thing I've changed here is the relative prices of beer and pizza and stayed on the same indifference curve. Therefore, I'm getting the impact of substitution. And what's the impact of that? Before the change in relative prices, I was consuming four pizzas and two beers. When I take into account solely the difference in the relative prices of beer and pizza, I see that, well, it makes sense, right? I see consumption increasing for beer because that makes sense. It's lower in price. I'm probably going to consume more of it. But I also get the substitution effect. The fact that I'm spending more on beer means I have less money available for pizza. Therefore, we see pizza consumption fall from 4 to, 2.2. So this illustrates the substitution effect. I'm increasing my beer consumption because it's cheaper, but it's impacting pizza production due to the fact that now I'm spending more on beer, I have less available for pizza. If we want to add in the income effect, we can just shift out that budget constraint to budget constraint 2. Budget constraint 3. That gives us the income effect. So what does that tell us about these two commodities? Believe it or not, the way these diagrams are shown, this shows that actually beer is an inferior good. Because as income goes up, so when I go from W to Z as my new equilibrium, the utility maximizing output level, all right, when that occurs, we actually see beer consumption falling. It was at 3.3 and then it falls to 3 because of the increase in income. If you're a good that when income goes up and your consumption goes down, it is an inferior good. All right. So what does it also tell us about pizza production? So for beer, when we control solely for income, consumption fell, making it an inferior good. What happens to pizza consumption? Pizza consumption increases when we go from W to Z. So because of the impact of income, pizza consumption increased. When consumption increases when income increases, that is a normal good. So this helps to illustrate normal versus an inferior good. And also it adds a level of complexity to the analysis because I told you that when a price changes, make sure you remember that changes in consumption are caused by two components. The substitution effect, because the price of beer and the price of pizza has changed. Beer is cheaper, therefore I'm going to spend more on beer and less than pizza. But when I lower the price of beer, that frees up income for me to spend. So we can also measure the income effect. I hope that was of some help to you. I'm going to tell you right now, I will never ask you a question where you have to illustrate the income and the substitution effects using a budget constraint and an indifference curve. I just wanted to give you an example of some economic theories and how economists take a look at things that are a little bit different than most people do. So make sure you realize that. If you're freaked out looking at this graph and figuring out how the hell am I going to recreate this on an exam, I'm not going to ask you to recreate this on an exam. I want you to understand all the principles behind it, being on the same indifference curve means. Points on the same indifference curve yield the same utility. I want you to remember that when indifference curves are further away from the origin, they represent higher levels of utility. I want you to understand how the budget constraint shifts. When income increases, we have a parallel shifting of the budget constraint. But when I change the price of an item, we have a rotation of the budget constraint. So make sure you remember that. Like I said, don't be too worried if you're worried about trying to recreate this income and substitution effects. That's a little too complicated to ask individuals taking an introductory course to do. If you're thinking about moving on further in economics, if you're going to take intermediate micro, for example, be a good idea for you to spend some time. And if you can understand this will be very helpful for you when you take that upper level class. If you have any questions, feel free and see me during my office hours. As always, they occur on Mondays from 4 to 6. Also realize I'll gladly try to schedule additional office hours at different times to make it a little bit more convenient for students.